And people are like,
But so they do take that. So he hasn't gotten back to it now. In fact, I don't think he was fired yet. He's like 12 an hour instead of 12. I should go back to him and find out. Do we need to take notes?
If you want to, hopefully everything is good. You want to write something down?
So maybe I should try the one you're asking.
I would think the stuff. Oh,
Oh, you're in. Yes. Is she?
Oh, Ann and I are gonna be trying to go together. Okay, it's coming to my house. Really nice.
I was supposed to do the beach this week. I was gonna work on it. Sunday. That's when Easter was here. We're having and then I go and say, I don't yesterday, everything. So I was at home with my stuff. But I come back some months later, there'd be a little bit more. Yeah. She was telling about.
We are live streaming. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to this workshop. We originally had set up that way, but I forgot that we had a PowerPoint presentation, so we'll all watch this way. We're live streaming, so we welcome those that are watching by YouTube, and this is going to be recorded so that those who cannot attend or watch at this time will be able to see this presentation later. I'd like to introduce you to Cindy Bannock, who has come to be with us this morning. We appreciate your being here, and I'll let her share anything about her background or anything else that she would like to. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for giving up your Sunday afternoons in this beautiful weather. This is a beautiful church, and I especially love your fellowship hall and your wonderful view of the mountains. I'm from the flatter part of Virginia. Right now, I'm in Williamsburg, and I work at Williamsburg United Methodist Church as the director of adult discipleship. Been there probably for close to 15 years, which is crazy to think about that. Prior to working there, I was at Virginia Beach United Methodist, Tabernacle United Methodist in Pocosin, and Hickory United Methodist Originally, I started working with children. I was the director of children's ministries, which is how I got into state sanctuaries. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. I am also a certified professional in the United Methodist Church. I have a certification in Christian education. So with all of that, I'm happy to be here, and I do like to try to help out the conference with these trainings whenever I can. After I'm finished here today, if your pastor or anybody in the church has any questions, I'm available to answer them as best as I can. You got two microphones.
Yeah. That's at the whole right up to you.
Like this.
Yes.
Okay, much better. So we're gonna get started, and before I get started, I'd like to ask, just by a show of hands, how many people here work with children or think they're gonna work with children? So a lot of children. Any youth workers? Couple? Vulnerable adults, we have, so, and just interested people, which is wonderful. I really appreciate what your pastor has said about the whole church being a part of this initiative. Everybody should be familiar with State Sanctuaries and should know that you are a State Sanctuaries church. I know enough that if somebody comes to you and says, well, what does that mean, State Sanctuaries? You can give a very basic explanation. You have a handout of the PowerPoint. I'm a very visual person, and so I like to have something to look at. So feel free to take any notes, or as this will be very informal as we go forward, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and we'll talk about it at that moment. So let's see. I'm going to move back a tad. So we're going to talk about child protection in the church, and what I'm going to talk about are the best practices. So generally a little history of State Sanctuaries and what are the majority of churches doing to ensure their facilities are safe for children, youth, and vulnerable adults. And then I believe Pastor Ed is going to talk about your policy. Is that correct? Okay. Great. So we're going to begin, and we'll move right to the second slide. The subject of child abuse, youth abuse, vulnerable adult abuse is not something that, we're going to be real excited about talking about. It's a difficult and complex subject. It makes us feel uncomfortable. It might scare away some of your church volunteers when they hear, what? I have to have a background check? I have to fill out a questionnaire? For too many years, the church has been blind to the fact that abuse can happen here. And it's very painful for persons who have been victims of abuse. So the purpose of our time here this afternoon is to explain that child abuse does happen in the church, and it can have very devastating emotional and spiritual and financial consequences. We're going to talk about different types of child abuse. We're going to identify why the church is vulnerable. And then we're going to talk about best practices in the church. But before we do that, there we go. Okay, we're going to just identify, we're going to do some definitions. So when we talk about who are our children, youth, and vulnerable adults, children are generally defined as through elementary school, birth through elementary school, depending on if your middle school starts in 6th grade or 7th grade. Youth are generally your middle school, high school ages, and vulnerable adults. Now, we at Williamsburg have a respite care program, which means that Monday through Friday, for about 4 hours, we provide kind of like an adult daycare, especially for people who are memory impaired. So vulnerable adults are those types of people who are mentally and or physically disabled. But notice, those are vulnerable adults can also be all of you, because what do? You work with children and youth and other adults who may, be impaired in some way. So we want to protect you, not only just our children and youth. Now, during this presentation, I may, from time to time, to not to have to say all those words, just say child abuse or abuse prevention. Know that I am referring to all those three groups. It's just easier to say one word instead of four. Okay, why are we worried about this? Well, in 1996, this is when Sanctuaries first started. The United Methodist, prior to that, the church really had no policy with respect to training or background screening or anything like that with their volunteers. And as people who work in the church, what do we always want? More volunteers, right? We can never have enough volunteers. So, up to that point, we were like, oh my gosh, I need people to work with me. I need somebody to work in the nursery. And, here comes Mrs. Smith, and she says, Cindy, I would like to work in the nursery. And what do I say? Yippee! You can start next Sunday. Here you go. Here's your room. Or you say you want to teach 5th grade, and I'm even more excited because nobody wants to work with those 5th grade boys. So I'm really excited. I'm like, great. Here's your curriculum. Here's your room. Start next week. Do I worry about who she is? Maybe I've seen her in church a little bit. I asked, do you have experience? Oh, yes, I've done this before. Great. So that's the way we used to do things until we realized that that's not so good. And unfortunately, a lot of our churches still do it like that. So the General Conference got together and got their stuff together and started mandating the state sanctuaries policy. And again, for the protection of children, youth, vulnerable adults, for protection of our workers, paid or volunteer, for the protection of the church, but more importantly, stated in Scripture, right? Just one verse that I'm sure you're all familiar with, just one verse of many. Mark 9, verse 37. Jesus said, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." And there are many other verses in the Bible that talk about Jesus and children. Jesus insisted that his followers be welcoming to children. What did he rebuke his disciples and said, "Let the children come to me"? Jesus reminded people that when they welcome children, they ultimately welcome and encounter God. So as a church, we have a spiritual and a moral responsibility. So how are we going to do that? Generally, we're going to make sure our buildings and our programs are safe. We're going to develop protection policies. We're going to screen, do criminal background checks. We're going to train everyone. And we're going to respond to charges of abuse appropriately. And most state sanctuary policies are based on these factors. Again, a little history. We started in 1996. And I want to bring to your attention, if you're not aware, there are books. You should have this book. Has Fred shaking his head, which means he has this. This is the Bible of Safe Sanctuaries. It was written by a woman called Joy Melton, who is a pastor, an elder, and an attorney. And she, way back in the 90s or so, realized that the church needed help with this. And so she worked on developing policies and procedures. Probably about 8 or so years ago, we were fortunate at Williamsburg to actually have Joy come and conduct a workshop for mostly our district. And she was a friend of one of our pastors, and so she reviewed our safe sanctuaries policy, which was a nice thing. This is her first book. It's the Basic Safe Sanctuaries Policies. Excuse me. Then she went on to write a book about vulnerable adults. So, and these are all available. You can get them from Cokesbury. They'll be happy to sell you some. And now, what do you think is the latest area of concern for safe sanctuaries, especially during the pandemic? What did we all revert to when we couldn't meet in person? Online, social media, Zoom. I saw on your computer there, you have a Zoom button. Oh my gosh, we became experts in Zoom. I am not technical by any means, but another lady and I put our heads together and we figured out Zoom. And we were the Zoom queens, and now it's passed on to someone else. But in a matter of like 2 and 3 weeks, we had to move our church from not meeting at all to, we want to meet and becoming the Zoom experts. So, Joy has now written another book, Safe Sanctuaries in the Virtual World. This book is actually not that new. I would expect to see some kind of updates. But you really need, once you get through your basic policy, you need to be thinking about like a communications policy that covers, communicating in safe sanctuaries in the virtual world, especially when you're dealing with youth. There are a lot of, and children too, but we know our youth are the most frequent users of social media. So you need to be taking a look at some basic best practices for communicating with youth over social media. That's a whole other subject. I'd have to come back and talk about that, but there are some good sample policies that you can look at online that will give you some basic guidelines. Okay, and the United Methodist Church has done pretty well with respect to making up for lost time and coming up with some really good policies. I'm going to move on to some abuse facts. And first of all, a definition, so we all know what we're talking about. Abuse refers to an intentional act. So abuse is not accidental. Committed by a person in a position of trust who harms or threatens to harm a child's, youth, or local adult welfare, physical, or mental health. I have two daughters, and the younger one, when she was small, was into gymnastics and dance and all this and that. We went through a period whereby in a course of about 3 months, she had 3 broken bones. Oh no, I'm gonna have the welfare people at my door. But it's just, these were all accidental injuries and everything. So, we know kids get hurt, but please note that abuse is intentional. All right, let's look at some other really sad, unfortunately. Most perpetrators of abuse are not strangers to children. 90% of our victims know their offenders. Offenders are usually parents, friends, relatives, etc. Child abuse isn't a problem, or the myth is that, oh, child abuse, it doesn't happen in the church. But we know it's very underreported. 1 in 7 children in the United States experienced maltreatment just in 2021. These are updated statistics. 1,750 children died of abuse or neglect in 2020. And if I could just say, child abuse is no problem in our community or in our church. A couple of years ago, there was a church in Chesapeake who had a big issue. United Methodist Church, big problem with their daycare. So, and that's just, like I said, a couple of years ago. I don't exactly, there was an issue of the wrong kind of discipline being used, etc. But, here it is, something that happens right in our community, and, you had the press right away and the TV coverage, and it was just a mess. So, yes, abuse and any kind of neglect or anything can happen in our church. Okay, we're going to talk about, oops, I'm too far. Now, the reason we're going to talk about very quickly the basic types of child abuse. Because as volunteers or paid staff in the church, you have access to children. And you might see something that you know is not quite right. So we want to make you aware of the different types of abuse and what they look like, so that if you suspect something, you can report it to your pastor. And all policies should have a very definite pathway of reporting abuse. We don't want you to go and say, let me tell you what I just learned about from little Billy. Yeah, church is full of gossip, we know that, but we don't want you to, if you have a concern, we don't want you to tell anybody except the pastor or whoever is, whatever the procedure is in your policy. Very important. So there are 4 major types of child abuse, and remember, youth, vulnerable adults. The most prevalent one is neglect, surprisingly. Then physical abuse, sexual abuse, and other types of maltreatment. Now, what do we mean by neglect? One more. Okay, neglect is when you do not address a basic need. Negligence, and you have on your handout a basic list: failure to provide adequate food, shelter or clothing, abandonment, failure to or refusal to seek treatment for illness unless it's for religious reasons, health hazards, ignoring a child's need for contact and nurture. So I think the first one is the most obvious. You know, if a child comes to church and it's snowing outside and he or she has shorts and flip-flops on, you know, maybe one time, you know, because sometimes kids like to dress the way they like to dress. But if this is a repeated pattern, you know, you may want to go and say, oh, Pastor Ed, you know, little Billy, the past couple of Sundays, has come dressed in shorts and a t-shirt, and it's 30 degrees out. So, you know, we want you just to be aware. Okay, physical abuse. Physical abuse happens, obviously, when there's an injury, and, you know, you will be able to see maybe scratches or black and blue marks, bruises. It can also, and it's not an accident. Remember my daughter doing gymnastics. Those were all accidents. This is intentional. And it can also include assault, shaking or slapping, like a baby, burning or scalding, kicking or strangling. You know, again, you see a repeated bruises or scratch or cuts or something on a child. You need to be observant. All right, the next one is sexual abuse. And by sexual abuse, we mean an act of sexual nature between a child and a teenager or an adult, significantly older, a more powerful person who initiates that contact for the purpose of his or her own sexual arousal. Notice that sexual abuse can include exposing a child to pornography or adult sexual activity. And again, symptoms of a sexual abuse would be, if a child was complaining about, pain and or soreness in genitals or something like that, or he suddenly becomes withdrawn and doesn't want to participate. Yes.
Another indicator, which unfortunately I encountered in situations, is when children use, I'll say,
Yes.
language that is not appropriate for their age, sexual language that is not appropriate for their age.
Yeah.
Usually a red flag that they have learned that somewhere, and that can be an indicator.
Yes, thank you. All of a sudden, children will, like you said, use words that, how do you know that? Or, even maybe play inappropriately or, things along the things that just don't look age appropriate or right to you. Okay, and finally, emotional abuse. That affects self-esteem, verbal assault or emotional cruelty, and I think unfortunately we're all too familiar with that. Put downs, just not treating a child with joyful enthusiasm. It does not always involve injuries that we can see, right? Close confinement, that's, if the child is not able to make friends or not allowed to do anything, inadequate nurture, excessive punishment, extreme discipline, or even something as drug or alcohol abuse, permitting that, and the child not age appropriate. All right, so these are types of abuse that we want you to become aware of. And I know in your policy, there's a very good explanation. There's a further explanation, I believe it's probably taken from the code. And you can read that. This is an overview. But we really want you as workers, as people who are trusted. And that's another point I'd like to bring up. Children will come to church and hopefully they view it as a safe place. And, they see their Sunday school teacher who, just week after week just gives them a big, appropriate hug, side hug. And, we're so glad to see you, Billy. What have you been up to this week? And this is the place where they should feel safe. And, who knows? They may want to confide in you to say, Mrs. Smith, I'm having a hard time. Or, something like that. So you're the ear that hopefully they will speak to. All right, so what if there is something going on here at church? So you as a teacher may observe, or as a worker or a volunteer with any of these groups, you may notice some strange behavior that could be traced back to something going on here at church. And these are just some possible signs. Anxiety, they don't want to be left in the classroom or the nursery. Now, we all know that kids suffer from separation anxiety, but this is different. And again, use your judgment. Reluctant to participate in church activities that they previously enjoyed. Don't want to be with certain people, nightmares, hostility, etc. Okay, so let's take a look at the typical, if you will, person who might be termed an abuser. They're friendly, they're courteous, they're over polite, they offer special friendships and secret confidences. They plan ahead and organize, entice with there we go, fun. Oh, forbidden fruit. You remember when you were younger, it was your mom and dad telling you don't go with anybody if they have a puppy. It's just, don't go with anybody if they're offering candy. Isolates the victim in order to have more control, gains of a sexual nature, and a repeated pattern of abuse. Now I'm going to tell you a little story of someone in our church, at Williamsburg Church, no names mentioned here, who fit all these patterns. And he was a gentleman, very, very nice man. Oh my gosh, outgoing, new member, just really excited to be in the church and to help out everybody. And this was not with a child or a youth. This was with our older people in the church. And he made it known that he had expertise with computers. And if anybody needed help with their computers, he would come to your house and he would help you with all your financial documents. And oh my gosh, everybody was, what a wonderful guy. He's going to come and do this. And sure enough, he started visiting other people, helping them with their financial documents, etc. Well, all of a sudden, our senior pastor gets a phone call from a child of one of these older people. What's going on with Mr. So-and-so helping my mom with her retirement and her Social Security and everything? Well, come to find out that Mr. So-and-so was not on the up and up. And, as he was helping with these older people with their documents, he was also taking some notes. And so was not the best of situations. And shortly after that, after our pastor had had a talk with him, guess what? He disappeared. He moved away to someplace else. So, yeah, you just never know how things are going to happen. But, this was someone who fit all the patterns of someone who would take advantage of other people. Okay, the next slide is things you can do, of which you're in the process of doing. You're going to develop a child protection guideline, make sure everybody knows about it. April is Child Abuse Prevention Month, FYI. You could kind of, give it a little push in that month. And you want, when you've got it all together, you really want to make sure that everything that you advertise or if you have on your website, you indicate that we are a safe Sanctuaries church. And you can put a little asterisk next to that and refer people to where they can find out what this means. But that's a big plus. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about best practices. And one of the cornerstones of best practices is the two-person rule. So no matter who you're working with, children, youth, vulnerable adults, you always want to have two people with people of those groups. If you don't have, make sure you always have windows. I'm looking at your doors here. They have some, in other words, if you were having an activity in here, there are your windows so that the room is visible. Now, you can say, oh, yippee, that sounds like a great idea. Two people. Well, what if I can't get volunteers? Or what if it's Sunday school and at 9:25 I get a phone call from, again, Mrs. Smith, and her child is throwing up and she can't come and be the teacher. What am I going to do? Well, in that instance, if you only have one person in the room, you can use floaters. I wouldn't suggest using floaters on a regular basis, but it's a good idea if you're in a pinch, or somebody gets sick, or they just can't come and be that second person in the room. That's obviously somebody who's going to walk up and down the hallways and check in, walk into the classroom unannounced, unexpected, and keep an eye on what's going on. You always want to make sure that your classrooms are open with windows. You can leave the doors open if you don't think the kids are going to run out. If you need to close the door, make sure you have a way to see in. Make sure parents or actually anybody knows that they can, parents especially, I shouldn't say not anybody can walk in the room, but make sure your classrooms are open. Cancel activities or combine classes if you don't have enough supervision. If you're doing counseling, especially with youth, make sure that's usually going to be a one-on-one situation because you're going to be talking, especially to a youth, about something that's personal. So this, for example, using this room would be good. You could sit maybe in the back, keep the doors open, make sure there's a line of sight that, maybe there's an office person who could see what's going on. Or go to a public place, like a restaurant or something, if you feel that's appropriate in that situation. I want to go back to the two-person rule. Yeah. When you have the two-person rule is two people who are not related. So my husband and I taught 3-year-old Sunday school. Okay, bless us, please. 3-year-old Sunday school for 8 years. And we survived. But that is really not the best idea because why? We're related, we're married. So best case is to have two unrelated people, not even from the same household. Okay? So if you have a couple who wants to teach, put a third person in there. Or maybe the husband will go teach that fifth grade boys class that nobody wants to. Or, you can split them up. But unrelated adults. Okay. Here's some more about the two-person rule. Travel with youth is very sticky, so you have to make sure you spell out what's going to happen when you take youth on a mission trip or an overnight trip. This sounds a little weird, but we're saying that unless it's a dormitory type room where everybody is sleeping together, adults should not sleep in the same room as youth, except if they're the parents. If this is not possible, then there should be at least 2 children and 2 adults in the same room, for example, like a dormitory type room. So it'd be all women and all men, that type of thing. Also, transportation, make sure there's always 2 people when you're transporting kids. Exception, I'm going to give you some ways to go around this. If for some reason there is only one person available to drive little Susie home after the bowling trip, you can call, the best thing to do in that situation is to call Susie's mom and say, "Hi, this is Youth Director Bob. I'm going to there's no one here to pick up Susie, and I'm the only one who can do this. So I'm going to leave the church now and drive directly to your home. Is that okay with you?" And we know it's going to take 10 minutes to get there. So the mom says, "Yes, that's fine." 10 minutes go by, they arrive at the house. Again, it's not the best, but it's a way that you have mitigated the situation to provide safe transportation. Okay. How are you going to provide best practices for your staff and your volunteers? What are you going to do? An application form. You might need to do an interview. You might ask for references. Definitely a criminal background check, and at the same time, make sure that they are familiar with your Safe Sanctuaries policy, which you have done in your policy. So that's a good thing. When you're recruiting and staffing, okay, persons in leadership should be at least 18 years old. No junior helpers, like especially, I want help in the nursery, and I'm like 14, and I don't want to sit through worship. So I'm going to go help in the nursery. Does that count as a volunteer? Mm-hmm. Yes, if the parents say it's okay, this 14-year-old can help, but there still needs to be 2 adults in the room. Okay? See where it says the person, the adult has to be at least 5 years older than the oldest child. This especially is important in youth group because you say your oldest youth is 18 and you've got a 20-year-old who wants to be a volunteer. No, that's not good enough. The 20-year-old can help, but they will not count as an adult volunteer. And like you said, anybody who's less than 5 years can function as an assistant. Lots of rules. All right, one of my favorites, the 6-month rule. And again, you know, we have to be careful of this because the church is always like, oh man, wow, Mrs. Smith just want to pick on you again. Mrs. Smith just arrived here. And I heard in her previous church, she ran the nursery like you wouldn't believe. Oh, I'm so excited. Mrs. Smith is going to come and take over our nursery. No, Mrs. Smith hasn't been here for 6 months. Okay, so the basic policy should state that people have to be involved in your church, active. We're not saying members, we're saying active in your congregation for at least 6 months. Now, again, a way to get around that is you could call, look at Pastor Ed, call up Mrs. Smith's previous church and say, you know, we have just heard all these wonderful things, and can you tell us about Mrs. Smith? And the previous Pastor Bill over in her previous church said, oh, she was the greatest leader I've ever seen in my life. I vouch for her 110%. You need to grab her and stick her in the nursery. And then do the regular background checks on her and everything. And you could get around that 6-month rule if you follow those procedures. Because what have you done? You've mitigated the risk. Okay. Background checks, we're going to require national background checks on all staff and volunteers who have routine contact with children, youth, and the vulnerable adults. Now, I would suggest that you need to define what does it mean if you're a routine volunteer. Because, say for example, the youth are going on their bowling trip, and all of a sudden you find out you're short a driver, okay? So this time, we're gonna call up Mr. Jones here. We'll make him Mr. Jones. And we're gonna say, Mr. Jones, you have a great big SUV, and I know you can get Mrs. Jones to go drive with you. And could you please come up to the church and take these kids to the bowling alley? And Mr. and Mrs. Jones say, oh, yes, we'd be happy to do that. And that's the only time they ever work with the youth, right? It's an emergency. Do we need to stop everything and do a background check on them? No, because we know they've only done this one time, and they'll probably never do anything like that again. So, because they're like, they trashed my SUV. So you need to define in your policy what you mean by routine. Is it 2 times? Is it 3 times? Is it, you help with the youth quarterly or what? Because there will be those instances where somebody is called in to supervise and it's only 1 time. Let's see. You need to designate someone hopefully, preferably on your staff, who will conduct these background checks and be responsible for the files. And you also need to decide how often you're going to update background checks, because you don't just do it once and say, yippee, he's good forever. No, because unfortunately, we know that sometimes something can happen, and we want to know what's going on. So at Williamsburg, we repeat them every 2 years. Oops. All right. Get to the end.
Church praise for them or you praise for them?
Church. Yeah, the service that we use, and I don't know, Pastor Ed, if you're going to say anything about this, but briefly, the electronic background checks that they have nowadays are wonderful because the church does not see any of your personal information. The only thing that I do the checks in my church, the only thing that I need is your name and your email. And I send this off to you, you fill out the information. It goes back to the background check companies in the clouds. I get a report that says clear, unclear, verifies a couple other things that really have no meaning. It looks like your address, but why do I care where you live? Or where you've lived for the past 20 years. But in that way, it's paperless. You don't have to worry about somebody breaking into the files and stealing your personal information. So it's really cool. Costs less than $20 for the church to do it. Just some miscellaneous good practices. Be careful when you're giving hugs, especially to little kids. You know, you want to go, but the side hugs are the best. Be careful. This happened to us at our vacation Bible school. We had a lot of youth helping, and especially some youth boys, and we had a lot of young elementary age girls, you know, jumping and climbing all over the youth boys, and that just was not cool. So, you know, try to keep that safe space among your, or between your volunteers and your kids. One final part, and we talked about there should be an annual refresher training. Training is needed for new volunteers. You want to make sure your congregation knows, publicize that you're a safe sanctuary church, and also check at least yearly the code of Virginia to see if there have been any changes that might affect you or the church. If you have an incident, make sure you follow the steps that's laid out in your policy. Let me go back to that. And I know you have some very good steps that are laid out in your church policy. If you suspect an abuse, do this, do that, do this, do that. Follow that. Because the worst thing is for too many people to learn about it, or the wrong person, and it gets out and it's more of a mess than it needs to be. And finally, as I said in the beginning, we have a new frontier. We need to be thinking about our cyber space, our cyber safety, and we need to be, like I said, getting Joy's new book, Joy Melton, and looking at that too, because that's, since COVID, that's here and now. Any questions? I went through that really quickly, and you're going to see when Pastor Ed goes through your policies, a lot of what I talked about is repetition. Again, these were best practices, And, think about it. You have the handout, hopefully, that will help you to remember some things. And you.
Thank you, Cindy. And does anybody have any questions for Cindy? I sent her our Safe Sanctuaries policy, and she reviewed it, and she has made some suggestions, nothing major, but and we'll be reviewing that with the administrative team, ministries team, and there may be some minor adjustments. But what I want to do is very quickly go through our policy so that you all know what elements are there. It's in several sections. The first section has to do with our purpose, why we have this. The next section is a biblical foundation, which she has already referred to. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, not forbid them." And so we are called to be a place where children can come and be safe. We have a section on the codes from the state of Virginia. And then there is a section on definitions. But the meat of this is in the last two sections. One is the actual procedures that we want to follow in the church. That's section 5 on page 4. She mentioned the 6-month rule. If somebody comes to our church, they need to be involved for 6 months before we give them any leadership responsibility for our children, youth, or vulnerable adults. They can assist, they can intern, they cannot take lead for 6 months. Staff screening, and I want to talk about this. Everyone, staff and volunteers, all need to have the criminal background check. And actually, it would be ideal if as many members of the church could get it. We're going to be contracting with Screening One. This is an agency that was recommended and has worked with the Virginia Conference. They have, Cindy, are you?
Oh, no, I'm not leaving. I'm just back to my purse.
The Virginia Conference, they have a contract with the Virginia Conference. We do not have to pay. It's the only cost is per screening, so there is no other cost. They actually, the gentleman I talked to said that he said it was a la carte, and there were several things, but after talking to him, I realized that, thank you, Bob. Okay.
Should be fine.
After talking to him, I realized that we really need to do the whole thing. What it involves is, first of all, a social security check. This is not your social security account. What they do is they take the social security number and find out all the names and addresses and information that's connected to that social security number. And he said why that's important was because sometimes people will change their name. And so they can go from one community and then to another, and they start using a different name, but they have to use the same social security number. And so he said social security check just reveals if there are any aliases or other things. So he said that actually helps with the background checks. But unlike the state police criminal background check, which only checks for the state of Virginia, okay? This company also checks not only the state of Virginia, but all other states, a national check, and federal courts as well, which he said you probably will not be picked up on with just a state criminal background check. State criminal background checks are $16 for volunteers. Screening One charges $22, $6 more, but it's more thorough, it's more accurate, and it's quicker. State of Virginia, the state police can take as long as 2 months, depending on how many they get. And and it's also by paper. And if you make one mistake on it, they send it back to you. You go start over. With screening one, the procedure is in two ways. One, the church gives them your name and email address, and they send you an invitation. Or you have their web address, and you have the church's log on number, and you can go in separately without an invitation and register for the church as being a volunteer at the church. Either way, the church has none of your information. It's all done online. Through the state, we wind up with a piece of paper that has your name, social security number, birth date, address, the whole shebang. With screening one and with other companies, they keep it all in a secure file, and the only thing we will see is if there is a hit, if something comes back. They don't give us any other information unless there is something that we need to know about. And even that is protected. Our policy says that only those persons that are on the Safe Sanctuaries committee will be allowed to see that information. The pastor primarily, but then, if need be, the other members of the Safe Sanctuary team. So that's the good thing about this, using a company like Screening One or others. It's very confidential. It doesn't expose your information at all, and it allows a very small number of people access to the information. If there is a hit, if there is concern, then the Safe Sanctuaries team will have that information and can deal with it. So we're going to go with Screening One, and I've already talked to them. They're getting our account set up. Supposed to email me. He said it probably takes about a week, so I'm hoping early this week. And I'm going to be sending the information to the congregation. People can start setting up. The church will be billed. Now, if you want to pay for your own screening, you're welcome to do that. But the church will be billed, and we'll just pay it as we, and I don't know how often they'll bill us, but that's going to be handled. You all are here for training. We expect all persons who are going to be working with our children, youth, and vulnerable adults to watch this video and do a criminal background check and read our Safe Sanctuaries policy and sign a form that says that they have read it, they agree to abide by it. Two adult rule, you all know that one. Two adults not of the same family or related. She mentioned about the one-on-one mentoring, always in an open space, so it's visible, line of sight. Discipline. We wrestled with this one because originally we had had very, very detailed. Do this, don't do that. But this portion basically talks about, in a more positive way, about affirming children and using methods that are not shaming or making them feel unworthy or unloved. And of course, no physical discipline. The only exception is in the case of nonviolent physical restraint. And the recommendation is, and my son, for instance, he doesn't do it for the training, but he knows somebody at the school he works at who actually does the training. It's not complicated, but they can teach us, and we can have several people in the church trained to know how to use nonviolent physical restraint. Probably, hopefully, never have to use it, but that's the only physical discipline that we would allow. Open classrooms, windows on all the doors. Okay. Notice, John, trustees, one of the nursery doors doesn't have a window in it. The other one does. There's a big window down at that end, but one of them doesn't. So we and if you're become aware of something, a need in the church to fit this, don't hesitate to speak up. Transportation, Cindy talked about that. We need to be very careful to make sure that we have 2 adults and that we're all aware of who's being transported and how. There are a few exceptions to the rules, as Cindy was saying, and that's one of her recommendations was to make sure that we're clear on that about the distinction between routine or non-routine. Now, the reporting procedure, this is extremely important because this, if it's not followed, it can destroy a church. And I've seen it. Not in one of my churches, thank heavens, but I've seen it in other churches, at least one other church, where when they didn't follow a proper reporting procedure, the church just fell apart. If there's an allegation or even a strong suspicion, you report it to the pastor first. If it involves the pastor, you report it to one of the other members of the Safe Sanctuaries team and to the chair of the Staff Parish Relations Committee. That's the first place you go with any allegations or suspicions. Okay? I, by the way, by law in the state of Virginia, am a mandatory reporter. So if I become aware, I am by law required to report it to Child Protective Services. Okay? And that's the next step. If it's reported to me, I must report it to Child Protective Services, Department of Social Services, and then immediately call the district superintendent. If it's about me, the member of the Safe Sanctuaries team or the chair of Staff Parish Relations, then they handle that. Okay? And that's how it gets started. Now, we have the information. This is up to date as of this time. All the information on that page, on page 8. That's the contact information. Documentation. Everybody, anybody who is involved has to start writing down. If that's what I'm responsible for. If somebody comes to me and says, I suspect, or little Johnny told me, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write down the date, time, and the information. It's confidential, but then I call social services and the district superintendent. If it involves a child, youth, or vulnerable adult, we have to inform the parents unless we suspect that it involves the parents. But we have to let the family know. And it should be me or really a member of the Safe Sanctuaries team. Pray. Right away, if we have an allegation or an incident, anybody that is involved needs to be prayed for the church. You may not become aware of this because you may not be involved in it, have the information, but anyone who is needs to pray about this because this is very serious. Like I said, can destroy a church and destroy lives. Somebody will, the pastor or somebody designated will contact the insurance company because they're going to have to be involved. We do not, in any shape, any way, no one is to confront the accused, the alleged abuser. We don't do that. We remove them from any position and let the process happen. And we don't investigate it. And that is where the communication and breakdown really starts hurting the church because, as Cindy said, hey, let me tell you about what I heard. Have you heard? Yeah. Somebody comes to you and says, I heard
Yeah,
Do you know anything about it?
yeah.
No, nope. We're not supposed to talk about those things like that, okay? Follow the chain, follow the procedure. Confidentiality. We really need to keep confidentiality because if someone is accused and it is a false accusation, it can really hurt. It can hurt the alleged victims if their name gets out there. You know, you want to keep this as confidential as you can. You want to follow the procedure and you want to let the authorities handle it. Okay? And finally, there will only be one spokesperson that the Safe Sanctuaries Committee will decide to, and only one spokesperson if it's necessary to say anything publicly. Only one spokesperson. I'm going to tell you all about a situation that I encountered personally. One of my churches, we had a preschool. And one day I get a call from a investigator from Child Protective Services. My name had been given by the parent of a child in our preschool, and said that they thought that I might have done something. Didn't know what, didn't go into specifics. I was then contacted by, and Child Protective Services has to involve the police, okay? So I was contacted by the sheriff's detective in the sheriff's department, and we had a conversation. I immediately called my district superintendent, told my staff parish relations chair, and called an attorney. Okay? Long story short, it turned out there was an uncle in the little girl's family who they already suspected to me. Well, I eventually got a letter from Child Protective Services saying that the investigation was closed, that they found nothing to any allegations, and that was the end of it. And under state law, when an investigation is closed like that and there's nothing to the allegations, eventually the record is supposed to be destroyed. Which I got a reassurance from them that yes, they would be destroyed. I still have that letter, so I held on to that. So it happens. Even if it's false, it happens. And we need to follow the procedure because, and Cindy, I'm sure you can relate stories too, where something was either did happen or was alleged to have happened, and the procedures weren't followed, and the church just split into multiple factions. We have to take this seriously, folks. This is important. And if there is any allegation, if there is anything at all, even if you see something that is well, we're not following our own rules. There's one person in the classroom with the door closed, and there's 3 kids and only 1 adult. Say something. We all have an obligation to this. Even if we're not working with directly ourselves with children, youth, and vulnerable adults, we all have a responsibility because I would hate to know, it would destroy me to know that I was aware of a situation and something happened. If it doesn't follow our policies and procedures, we need to speak up and say, wait a minute, this isn't the way we should do it. Because our children, our youth, and our vulnerable adults, they should be able to come here and know this is a safe place where they're going to receive God's nurturing love in a way that helps them grow into healthy, whole persons of God. And that's why we have this. Everyone who has reviewed the policy is asked to fill out the page 11 that you agree with the policies and that you've watched or attended the workshop. And this is the only thing in the files that we will keep. Okay? So if somebody says, okay, so you say you're a Safe Sanctuaries church. What do you mean? Well, we can say we have 15 right now, or 20, or 30 people who have had the training. I want to be able to say that. You all should be able to say that, so that we can tell people we are a Safe Sanctuaries church. And volunteers, the last page is just an information sheet that if again, it's confidential, but again, we should not assume we know everybody. Okay?
Are you saying we will be filling this one out even though we don't need it for the clearance? 13?
Yeah, 13, well, I guess 11 is, thank you for that. 11 is a verification that you've read and agreed to and have participated in our Safe Sanctuaries training. 13 is for all the volunteers. That's the sheet. I'm sorry. That's the sheet, the information sheet that we will have. That's the only information we will have. But
So you are going to keep this written?
yes, in a secure file. But that will be particularly important for two reasons. First of all, it'll be important for new people. Okay, if we have visitors, if somebody joins and they want to volunteer, we say, we need your information. The other thing is, and don't want to spook anybody on this, but if there is an allegation, we want to be able to turn to our file and say, we have this information right away. No guessing, no, well, I'm not sure where they live, or I don't have their address, or we don't know where they came from. So that's what that it's confidential, and it would not be used in any way, shape, or form except if there's a specific need under our policies for it. Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
I have one.
Yes.
So you mentioned that there should be a periodic renewal or and I did not see that. I may have specifically.
Yeah, that's one thing you can have.
Yeah, it's one of her recommendations to us, and that will be a thing that we will correct.
Okay.
We'll make a revision of that. I have her recommended changes,
Yep.
which I will bring to the administrative team and the ministries team, and those, and all of the ones that she's recommended, none of them are major changes to the policies. They're just,
It's a little tweak.
they're tweaks.
So do you want us to be reading both of these papers today?
Yeah, the one, page 11, definitely. If you can fill that out, that you have
We've been here.
reviewed the policies you've attended and you agree to abide by them. You fill that out, and that starts our file of being able to say, we have this many people who have agreed to our Safe Sanctuaries and been trained. The other page, we'll gather as we go along.
A line on page 13, identification.
Yeah, that, actually, this was from our old policies, and when it transferred over, I noticed that, and I thought, okay, what is that? No, don't worry about
The
that.
number of my membership card?
Yeah, hold out your church membership card, that number there. Okay. Yes,
Just for clarification about mandated reporters, you're probably not the only mandated reporter in the congregation. So if a mandated reporter brings an allegation to report to you, then they would also have to report, and then you would also have to report.
yeah, mandated reporters, there's no exception of, well, I told somebody else, I told the pastor. No, if there's another mandated reporter, yes, but what really should happen is, if there's another mandated reporter and they came to me and they hadn't reported it yet, then right on that spot, we go ahead and together. I would do that. Cindy, what is your take on
My
that?
take on whether or not people who volunteer and work for the church are mandated reporters is a little blurry. I noticed in your policy, you cited the, private organizations or whatever. In the code, it says they're mandated. But is the church a private organization? I don't know. It doesn't really spell it out. I think in the best case scenario is if you suspect something, report it to the pastor. Under the Good Samaritan laws, you're not going to be held liable for a false report. So, my guess, where our Sunday school teachers and volunteers, mandated reporters, that's blurry to me. But I would use my judgment if I think I see something. It's not going to really hurt anyone. Because you can't be prosecuted and, or just call. There is a toll-free number that, you can call after you tell the pastor, if you want to go ahead and report it yourself. But, yeah, that's a blurry area.
Yeah, and the United Methodist Church,
Pastors.
yeah, pastors are mandatory. I mean, that's their about that. But our policy says shall immediately
Right.
report the incident. And I have known situations where people became aware of an allegation or actual abuse, and they waited.
Yeah.
And that, no. So I would say to anybody here, if you come and report to me, I'll probably say, right now, we're gonna call. Because there are toll-free numbers and it's not like, well, we gotta wait until Monday morning at 9 o'clock. You don't do that. So, but yeah, if there's a mandatory, somebody else's mandatory reporter, if they come to me, we're gonna do it together. Any other questions, comments? Well, I thank you all very much for coming. I hope this has been helpful, educational, beneficial to our church. I wish that we had had twice as many, but we will eventually get to that point. We thank those who joined us on YouTube. And again, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you, Cindy, for coming.
We're in Williamsburg, where the big mother church on Jamestown Road, crossing the college. So right down from Merchant Square, so you go shopping, and then you can come for a visit.
And we can drop her in. We know Cindy.
That's right, I'm there every day except Friday and Saturday.